indications, we are going on to New Hampshire victorious.
Last night in Iowa, we received more votes on the first and second round than any other candidate.
Mayor Pete and Bernie Sanders both declaring victory after the meltdown of the Iowa caucuses. But could Donald Trump and Mike Bloomberg be the real winners from Iowa? I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times. Welcome to the New York Times Close Up. We'll talk politics in a moment. Also on tap, we'll discuss Chief Justice Roberts and his handling of the impeachment trial and some of the huge cases on the Supreme Court's docket this year. They range from abortion rights to gun rights to Trump's financial records. But first, the Democratic candidates for president. They moved on from Iowa's coffee shops, corn dogs, cows made from butter, to the snows of New Hampshire. The caucus chaos may have denied any of the Dems a momentum boost. The polls all over the place. The Boston Herald New Hampshire poll has Sanders leading Biden by 7 points, Warren in third. Another poll has Sanders up by 15. Nationally, the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, a virtual tie, Sanders topping Biden by 1 point, Mike Bloomberg ahead of Mayor Pete. But the LA Times poll has Biden up by 16. Go figure. Meanwhile, Donald Trump had a very good week, took credit for just about everything in a victory lap State of the Union. Acquitted in the Senate, posted the highest job approval number of his presidency in a new Gallup poll, 49%. So what does the road ahead look like for the Democrats? Will there be long-term political fallout from impeachment? And will Trump be even more emboldened following his acquittal? Plenty to talk about with Clyde Haberman, contributing writer for the New York Times, Eleanor Randolph, also a contributing writer at the Times and author of The Many Lives of Michael Bloomberg, a must-read ahead of Super Tuesday, and Dr. Heath Brown, a professor here at City University. Clyde, one thing that you have mentioned before, and we've seen this in the Iowa caucuses, as reliable as those results may be going into the weekend, if you look at Biden and Buttigieg and Klobuchar coming in out of those caucuses, those so-called moderate candidates add up to more than 50%. So what does that say about where the Democratic electorate is at this point?
It says that if they were wise, they would probably nominate one of those three and not go for the two folks who are quite far on the left, who might very well lead them to a 1972 George McGovern-like situation. That's how I see it now. Whether that's how it'll work out, we'll see. I also think one good thing to come out of Iowa is that maybe finally the stake will be driven through the heart of the Iowa caucuses, and for my money, New Hampshire's very early primary too. I mean, Iowa has screwed up now time after time. This is not an isolated case. They messed up in 2012 with the Republicans. They did it again in 2016 with the Democrats, and just you've had enough chances here, folks. Time to move on.
Heath?
There's so much noise and not very much signal coming out of Iowa, and that's been the case for a long time. I think you're absolutely right. What do you make of this race where you now have all these 4 people coming out on top in Iowa? I don't think anyone can make very much of anything. Who's on top, Mayor Pete or Bernie Sanders? I don't think we know, and I don't think we really care. I think it's ultimately doesn't matter that much right now. I think the voters further on are going to make a much bigger difference in this race.
So, Eleanor, wherever we wind up a month or two from now, does Mike Bloomberg look smarter and smarter, holding off till Super Tuesday?
I don't know. You know, it's never really worked for anybody to hold off. But he's if you watch television, and you can't even change channels. He's on every channel, and he's spending hundreds of millions of dollars on these ads. I don't know. I mean, he has said that March 3rd, which is Super Tuesday, he's going to if he doesn't do well there, that's California, Texas, a huge dollop of delegates, that if he doesn't do well there, he's going to rethink his campaign.
And how do we define well? How well does he have to do?
I think he'll define that. I don't know what that means. I think he just has to be in the running. But the main thing I think that's important about Bloomberg at this stage is that he has promised that if he doesn't do well, he'll keep spending money to attack Trump for the Democrats. And he set up this digital operation, which the Democrats desperately need. It's called Hawkfish, and it will...
What's it called?
Hawkfish.
What does that mean?
It's a fish.
Uh-huh.
It's a fish that sort of has a funny nose, and I don't know that it means anything more than that. But anyway, this whole operation, which comes...
I'm going to ask you about that again next week.
What, hawkfish?
Yeah, why hawkfish?
All right, I'll do more work on it. It turns out it's one of the fish in the big aquariums that Bloomberg has in his operation. I don't know whether it's particularly vicious or whether it's particularly smart or what it does, but anyway,
Is it rich?
Right.
It's rich, that's for sure. But that operation is really meant to deal with all the digital ways that the Democrats have been deficient in doing.
And where he could really have an impact, of course, is if he's putting money into Democratic Senate races in the fall.
That's right. I don't know that he is, but I would guess. I mean, look, he's talking about spending as much as $1 billion on this campaign that we just talked about. He's worth, some estimates are close to $60 billion. It wouldn't hurt him to spend a lot on the Senate races. It wouldn't hurt him at all.
Obviously, we'll know a lot better after Super Tuesday how effective this is, but buying an election apart as an issue, do all these ads really make a difference? Do they have impact on the electorate?
Yes. Yeah, if you saturate people enough, Joseph Goebbels told us that long ago.
Oh,
and this
that's
is
not fair.
Well, it's fair to the extent of if you repeat a lie often enough, people begin to believe
But
it.
these aren't lies. These are about Trump.
But whether it's a lie or whether it's the truth, if you repeat anything often enough and pound it into people's heads, they come to believe it and absorb it as their reality. And so it almost makes no difference whether it's true or not true.
Let's talk about impeachment a moment. The president acquitted, straight party lines except for Mitt Romney. Is this a victory for Trump? Did the Democrats make a mistake? Is the investigation going to continue and more come out? Where does this leave us?
Well, it leaves us with a president who I think is going to be unbound. Susan Collins said one of the stupidest things I've heard in a long time, which is saying something considering the source, that she thinks he's going to somehow be cleansed by this and chastened and will be different. And as we saw at his hour-long love fest for himself at the White House on Thursday afternoon, no such thing has taken place. I think he's going to come out more vicious than ever, and I would watch out if I were Mitt Romney and make sure that I have a food taster, among other things.
So did we learn anything from impeachment? Heath?
Oh, I think we learned a lot about Mitt Romney. Everything else seemed to go according to script.
Well, Romney didn't have much to lose, did he?
He didn't. So whether he was courageous or not is hard to say. But I think that was perhaps the most interesting part of some proceedings that we could have predicted 2 months ago. The way it all came down. Mitt Romney was a little interesting. I don't think he was nearly as courageous as maybe he thought he was being. He doesn't go up for re-election for another 4 years.
I think, one of the things I think that was really important about impeachment, and we really haven't talked about it very much, is the Russia connection. Because it is another opportunity to look at how Trump is doing everything to help the Russians. The Ukraine thing, we can talk about how he, wanted to help himself in his campaign. But what really happened was that he was doing, whether he meant to or not, he was doing Vladimir Putin's job in Ukraine by withholding troops, by withholding weapons, by withholding money. That is exactly what Putin wants.
And he'll do something like this again. You can almost take it to the bank, because he started this game with Zelensky of Ukraine literally the day after the Mueller report chose not to pursue him any further. And this man takes that then as not just exoneration, but full vindication of everything that he's done. Bill Clinton at least had the decency to acknowledge after he was acquitted in the Senate that basically apologizing, at least he did briefly, for having put the country through this unnecessary ordeal. You'll never hear a word of that from this guy.
And you heard very few Republican senators say what he did was wrong, but it wasn't impeachment.
They're all complicit in this, and they're the party of well, they've given themselves up as a democracy party as far as I'm concerned.
I was struck in the State of the Union, and let's talk about Nancy Pelosi in a minute. I was struck at how many things that Trump took credit for, particularly economic things, that in the Times fact-checking, we said were mostly true. We said they needed context. They weren't 100% true. The economy improved not by 70 million, but by 60 billion. But that a lot of it was, in fact, accurate. Not all of it, but a lot of it.
But it all started under Obama.
Okay.
And he has taken credit for all of it and acted as if he indeed inherited a country that was carnage.
But if the economy was tanking, we would have blamed him.
That may be,
course.
but he still, nonetheless, is taking credit for something that began under the guy who he has spent his entire presidency trying to dismantle.
Heath?
Well, this is in part why the polling numbers right now that show most of the Democratic candidates, at least in one-on-one national races, ahead of Trump. With this positive an economy, to be in that position as president, you have to do a lot. And so I think right now, everything else would predict a Trump victory in November, except for his behaviors. And all of that is making this race right now much more competitive than it would be otherwise. This economy and a standard issue Republican president would be a near guarantee for a win in November. The fact that that's in doubt, I think, is all the responsibility of the president.
Well, so what is it? Would he have gotten elected without that behavior? Can he get reelected because of that behavior? How does that work?
I think he doesn't know. I think that it's unlikely that we're not going to come back here in a couple months and talk about the next chaotic thing that the president has walked himself into, because I think he loves it.
And of course, there's a long time between now and November.
Well,
Eleanor?
one of the things that people talk about is that even though the White House is chaotic and it just seems crazy every day we get some news bulletin, the Trump campaign is very, very well organized and very methodical, and they started working on Inauguration Day, and their digital operation, which I was talking about earlier, is fantastic. And so if Trump gets reelected, it's going to be that operation, not what he did in the White House.
And also dismantling a lot of government programs that we barely know about, and also being vindictive about big states like California and New York in ways that seem to defy the administration on states' rights, which it otherwise seems to defend. Let me ask you about Nancy Pelosi ripping up the speech. I'm not going to do that with my notes. But A, was it ridiculously theatrical? Was it spontaneous? What do you think?
Well, I don't care. I just loved it. It was exactly the way I felt at the end of that speech, and she somehow sort of personified it by ripping it up. I mean, the response from the Republicans has been laughable. They're talking about decorum. They're accusing her of not having any decorum. Have they looked around lately? No. I mean, especially at the White House. It was theatrical, but I have to say, I for one was happy to see it.
I'm with her. And maybe it was pre-planned. Who knows? Maybe. I don't know. But, well, you never know. It may not have been. But I'm sure it became solidified in her mind when Trump refused to take her. It turned his back on her when she extended her hand to shake his hand. Yeah. And after that, as far as I was concerned, okay, buddy, all bets are off. You don't deserve 1 ounce of any courtesy.
Thanks to Eleanor Randolph, Clyde Haberman, Dr. Heath Brown, and coming up next, we'll talk about how Chief Justice Roberts dealt with the president over the impeachment trial and the incredibly important cases on the Supreme Court's docket this term.
I do not regard those isolated episodes 150 years ago as sufficient to support a general authority to break ties. The presiding officer declines to read the question as submitted.
Chief Justice John Roberts declining to ask a senator's question that might have unmasked the name of the Ukraine whistleblower. He also made it clear he had no intention of casting the tie-breaking vote if the Senate was 50-50 on impeachment witnesses. Roberts took a low-key approach to his responsibility of presiding over the Trump impeachment trial. He seemed to take a cue from former Chief Justice William Rehnquist, who presided over the Clinton impeachment. Rehnquist famously said of his performance, quote, "I did nothing in particular and did it very well." So how should we judge the job that Roberts did? And as he returns to his day job as Chief Justice, the Supreme Court is in the midst of a term that could produce landmark decisions on abortion, gun rights, gay and transgender rights, the Dreamers, and Donald Trump's financial records. Let's talk about it all with Jesse Wegman, a member of the New York Times editorial board who focuses on the High Court. He's also the author of the upcoming book, Let the People Pick the President, the case for abolishing the Electoral College. Jesse, I was expecting, maybe hoping, that Justice Roberts would take a more active role in this impeachment trial, that how could he preside over a trial where there were no witnesses, no evidence, and yet say this was a fair trial, even swear in witnesses who promised to be impartial when they already said they had made up their minds about guilt or innocence. So even though he theoretically had a lot of latitude, because the Constitution merely says he presides, how narrowly did he define his role and why?
Well, I'll say, first of all, that this was the last place John Roberts wanted to be. At any time, I think, in his tenure, that would be true. It's more true this year than ever. I think this is one of the most consequential terms the court has taken up in the 15 or so years that he's been Chief Justice. I think, as much as it pains me to say it, because I do think that the Senate Republicans and Mitch McConnell in particular were really just conducting something that had no resemblance at all to anything we would consider a trial. The Chief Justice did his job, and he did, I think, what the Constitution expected. He could have taken a more aggressive role. I think in the end, when we talk about impeachment trials as being like trials, like is the important word there, right? They aren't trials. They are political exercises fundamentally that include many of the accoutrements of what we think of as a real criminal or civil trial in the court system, but they are not that. And the Chief Justice, despite wearing his black robe, is not a judge. He is a presiding officer. I think he was right in the end to say, this is a decision that the Senate has to make. I think the one place that you mentioned where he really could have gone one way or the other was on whether or not to break a tie vote. As it came down, there were no tie votes to break, and that it was lucky for him because no matter what he decided, if that had actually confronted him, it would have been, he would have had hell to pay.
You wrote in the Times the other week that the president's defense was legal claptrap, but it was also likely to work, and it did.
I mean, look, Donald Trump has proved as well as anybody could that it really doesn't matter what you say as long as you're on the right team, you're going to get a pass. Republicans have been completely explicit about that. With the exception of Mitt Romney yesterday, they all fell into line. And I just don't think it really matters what Trump does or says. I think they're going to back him because they get what they want from him. And also I think they're afraid of him. As Sherrod Brown, the senator from Ohio, wrote in the Times today, or yesterday, I guess now, they were very clearly afraid of what it would mean to oppose him. It's ironic because they took great exception to Adam Schiff's statement that the president would have their heads on a pike if they were to go against him by voting to call witnesses. Mm-hmm. They were very offended by that. But as Sherrod Brown said, the truth hurts.
Looking at the docket of the Supreme Court, lots of big cases, as you say. Without predicting, do we have any sense where this court is going on those cases?
Well, so, you have the cases that are directly involving Donald Trump or his administration, right? So we have the most obvious is the one you mentioned, his financial records, mm-hmm. Which is actually a trio of 3 cases, two coming out of the House of Representatives, which is trying to subpoena some of those records, and one coming from the district attorney in Manhattan, Cy Vance, which is looking into campaign finance violations. I have to say, just based on precedent in these cases, I don't think the president has a very good case here, and I think the likelihood is he's going to lose those cases. If he loses them, those cases are going to be heard in late March, which means a decision comes in June probably, possibly even late June. We're in the middle of the presidential race right then, in the thick of it. I think that could be a real X factor in how this election plays out, because I think we all know that Donald Trump's finances are there's a lot to be learned about from Donald Trump's finances.
And then we have gay rights, transgender rights, abortion.
Sure. So then we have sort of the classic lineup of cultural hot button topics that the court has had to take increasingly in the last few decades. In the last few years, it's been quieter. But those cases in particular, so the Title VII case, which is about whether discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or on the basis of transgender status falls under Title VII protections, right? Title VII bars discrimination on the basis of sex. Mm-hmm. And the question are these discriminations on the basis of sex? Are people who are discriminated against fired from their job for being gay, fired from their job for being transgender? Mm-hmm. Are they being discriminated against on the basis of sex? It actually raises some very interesting interpretive questions in terms of the Constitution. And then we have this other case which didn't come up yet, but is also equally important, I think. And because I've written this book, I was paying close attention to it, is a case on the Electoral College and how the Electoral College works.
We'll invite you back to talk about that book when it comes out in March. Thanks to Jesse Wegman, and I'll add my thoughts on CODA next. That book is going to be awfully important in this year's election. Looking for one thing to be thankful for from America's painful experience with impeachment? It's Preston Sturges's satire, The Great McGinty. This is the 80th anniversary of the Oscar-winning film's release. The script was inspired by the removal of Governor William Sulzer of New York after he defied Tammany political boss Charles F. Murphy's choices for patronage appointees. When Governor Sulzer refused to consult the Democratic Organization on Appointments, Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously wrote, Murphy did not argue, he impeached and removed him. Those purely partisan votes in Congress on impeachment and acquittal of President Trump suggest that it's still too soon to croon the party's over. The Great McGinty got some great reviews, although Bosley Crowther of the Times figured that film goers in 1940 would find it more amusing given the recent Depression and the onset of World War. With graver matters to concern us, and with a more comfortable sense of civic security, Crowther wrote, it is sublimely easy to laugh at the shameless tricks and vulgarities of out-and-out political buccaneers. Today, we're civically insecure again, but boy, do we ever need a laugh. The plot and script of The Great McGinty still reverberate. The presiding judge in Governor Sulzer's trial in 1913 concluded that his conduct was highly dishonorable, but not illegal or criminal. Sulzer himself said he was the victim of not a deep state, but of, quote, an invisible government. He was convicted. He ran for governor again, but lost. Among the quotes in the film was a grafter's pious explanation that you've got to pay somebody to protect you from human greed. And a politician lamented that if it wasn't for graft, you'd get a very low type of people in politics, men without ambition. Especially, McGuinty's wife interjects, since you can't rob the people anyway. How's that? The politician asks incredulously. Well, what you rob, you spend, and what you spend goes back to the people, Mrs. McGuinty explains. So, where's the robbery? For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.